Popcorn Junkies, and welcome to the worst films, or yes, the worst films of 2024. These are, if not necessarily the worst films, these were the films that were the biggest disappointments of the year. Some of them are total, for me, train smashes, car crashes, just total derelictions of filmmaking duty, whereas others were less about how bad they were, but more about what a disappointment they were. So these are disappointments, but there are also a couple in here who can not forget my total hostility towards Tar a couple of years ago. There's a couple of films in there in this list today for which I have zero tolerance or respect, and I'm just going to have to I just need to be able to go to some kind of therapy group in order to unpack my feelings about them. I want to kick off with the Amy Winehouse biopic. Before I kind of lay into this, I do want to sort of give a bit of a shout out to Marissa Abela, who played Amy Winehouse. I thought she threw in a really committed performance within a surrounding film that was just beyond simplistic, toy townish, obvious, a clear attempt to rehabilitate, in a sense, the profile or reputation of Amy Winehouse's father. It struggled and creaked beneath the weight of the Amy Winehouse estate, wanting to, if you like, Photoshop the uncomfortable details, if not necessarily of Amy Winehouse's descent, then certainly of the culpability, not that there is necessarily any culpability of those around her demise, but, you know, the relationships between those. It felt like a course correction film. It felt like a film that was made, access was given to her music and to her estate, so long as it presented certain individuals in an infinitely more glamorous light. And I think that was the case as much for her father figure as it was for the Jack O'Connell's character, who, again, I thought Jack O'Connell was brilliant in this, as was Marissa Abela. But it kind of was also a rehabilitation job for Blake Fielder Civil, of course, Amy Winehouse's partner. So I felt this was just a real disappointment and a real disservice to the memory of the story of a sensational singer who had a tragic fall from grace. And it was just, again, I hate to say it, Sam Taylor Johnson, the director. She's not, for me, an inspirational director. It's filmmaking by numbers. Its scenes are covered in a really obvious fashion. There's no sort of fizz or excitement or creativity or innovation, which is odd because she's an artist as much as she is a filmmaker. So back to black. A real kind of disappointment that was. Next up is a weird one. It's kind of one that should one have expected anything more of it. The Fall Guy. The Fall Guy, starring Emily Blunt and Ryan Gosling. And I think much was made of this film because, of course, it was the first film for Ryan Gosling after Barbie. And I think we all went to see this film thinking maybe we could just get a little smidgen of what we liked about Ken from Barbie. But this film, even though many advocates and defenders of The Fall Guy, the film, will use this as their line of defence for what was a really below par, sub-zero quality thriller, the argument used is, but this is riffing and referencing back to the slightly stylistically kind of dull, quite cliche-ridden sort of days of the TV series starring Lee Majors from the 80s, 70s and 80s. That doesn't float, I'm afraid. You can revisit and remake and relaunch a brand or a franchise or a show from the 70s or 80s, and you can do it in a competent, stylistic, fancy way. What particularly was a disappointment with The Fall Guy was not only was there zero chemistry between Emily Blunt and Ryan Gosling, not only was it not funny, but this was made by the production company that did things like Bullet Train. I think David Leitch, the director, was also the director of Bullet Train. This was made by a group of stunt coordinators and stuntmen. It's about a stuntman in a stunt world. But the stunts were beyond ordinary and boring. And so even in its own terms, a film about a stuntman which had shit stunts in it and had zero on-screen chemistry between any of the actors, I just thought it was a ghastly waste of time. Next up, this is more a disappointment than it was a bad film. And in a weird way, I feel looking back across the year towards this film, it was always destined to disappoint. This is the Osgood Perkins horror film starring Nick Cage, Longlegs. This possibly had one of the most successful, most enigmatic kind of social media campaigns in the build-up to it as a horror film. You know, we clearly had a almost pseudo Michael Jackson-esque portrayal of a serial killer played by Nick Cage. And the build-up and the kind of sense of excitement and intrigue and horror. But the most horrific part of this film was the first death at the hands of a gun in an FBI sort of action scene right at the beginning. One of our kids came out when we'd seen this film and said, so hang on a minute, let me get a grab on this film. So Nick Cage didn't actually kill anyone. No. I think the problem with this film is it had a great sort of attribute in the form of a really odd-looking, odd-sounding, strange Nick Cage playing this sinister, long-haired, sort of creepy guy. And when it was successful was in that one shot at the front of the film when he's slightly kind of cut out of frame and he's sort of singing a song and you just feel creeped out. But it just never delivered on its promise. It kind of was big on trying to create atmosphere, but there was neither sort of horror, nor was there anything surprising. And we discovered throughout the arc of the film that actually Longlegs himself did less and less, and so it never amounted to the sum of its parts. And I don't even think the sum of its parts were particularly vast. It lent on really weak, a sort of mum who was a nun who went on the shooting spree. But this, all in all, was a profound misfire for me. It was one of those films that, far from thinking about it more after watching it, I got more and more frustrated about the excitement we'd all been exposed to in the build up to it. And then the actual payoff for me was deeply disappointing, very unscary. I wasn't scared, I didn't feel unsettled, and I think you're kind of scraping the bottom of a barrel out when your most horrific moment is slamming your head, as Nick Cage does, repeatedly against a table. There's been enough of that. We've seen that in Hereditary. It's a classic horror film trope, but this film didn't offer anything more. And so it wasn't half as inventive as I think it liked to think it was, or the press machine, publicity machine for it, was trying to make us believe. Now, interestingly, one of my top films of the year, I think it was my top second film of the year, was Poor Things by Yorgos Lanthimos. Well, one of my worst films of the year, I'm sorry to say this, is Kinds of Kindness. And isn't that interesting? Doesn't that just show you that it's not about having a blind allegiance to creative talent, to a director? It's not just about only like with Joker, for example. I'm sure people go, oh, well, you like Joker, you're also going to like... No, not necessarily. If the film isn't good and if a film is confused or is pretentious, which I feel this film was, I'm going to call it out. I loved Poor Things. I thought, when I went in to see Kinds of Kindness, I was so supremely excited. And yet again, I wonder whether this film could have only ever really disappointed because of the huge impact that Poor Things had on me. This was the kind of anthology film, a black comedy, an absurdist, surrealist kind of comedy. It starred, people like Jesse Plemons, again, Emma Stone, Willem Dafoe. Margaret Qualley was in there. She obviously was in the very successful The Substance. And I just found this film purposefully confusing. I felt it fell foul of that thing they say that James Joyce tried to do when he wrote Ulysses, which is, I want to keep people guessing and thinking and trying to work out what the deeper meaning on this is for years, even if there's no deeper meaning. I thought it felt it was complicated. I mean, if you look at all the posters and all the artwork around it, it was clearly riffing on surrealism. But it was a surrealism that for me was low on laughs. I mean, there was an absurdism and surrealism to Poor Things, but there was a strong thread. And I wonder, again, whether that was because Poor Things had some relatively strong source material in the book. This felt rudderless. This felt like a series of kind of experimental, surrealist, absurdist thoughts in the mind of Yorgos Lanthimos, which isn't to say that some of the moments weren't amusing or alarming or shocking, but I felt like it was like I do with a lot of surrealist art. Sometimes I just think it's about shocking for the sake of shocking, and there's little kind of thematic behind it. I didn't feel a theme. I wasn't asked, I wasn't challenged on anything. There were shocks, there were surprises. I mean, I think probably the standout moment in the film was Jesse Plemons saying, let's watch our old family footage, and actually it's footage of them all having a four-way orgy. There were shocking moments, but in a weird way, if there hadn't been Poor Things this year, I'd have seen this film and thought, I think Yorgos Lanthimos has got a few obsessions that he needs to sort out, really, because otherwise these films are just going to become a sort of, really an opportunity just to pry into the darker corners of a director's mind. So the next film that's on my worst or most disappointing films of the year, and this wasn't even a really overtly sort of anti-response. I didn't watch this film and have a negative response, and in fact when I think I reviewed it, I think I gave it a reasonable score. But I think this film was profoundly underwhelming to me in a way, again, perhaps was about expectation. Civil War by Alex Garland. Nothing he's made has quite reached the heights, I feel, of Ex Machina. Annihilation was definitely intriguing and interesting, but kind of lost its way. Men was, again, had great moments in it, but was a bit too much and imbalanced. And there's something in a film which is called its sort of internal rhythm. It's not even necessarily a defined rhythm, but just the organic rhythm of a film sometimes just feels a bit jerky and a bit sort of stop-starty. That's what I felt about Men, but I also felt that about Civil War. I was shocked and surprised, essentially with Civil War, to see Alex Garland absolutely wash his hands off, and in quite a cowardly fashion, I think, ignore the incoming huge political drama that has engulfed America through the election, Trump winning the presidency. You've got rich pickings for different sides of a civil war in America, and whilst it's kind of very lightly inferred in this film that the president has kind of enforced a third term on the country, i.e. he's broken all the rules, Nick Offerman's kind of president in Civil War, and whilst there were undoubtedly some real standout scenes in this film, thinking most specifically once again of Jesse Plemons' scene, here's the rub on that. Jesse Plemons stepped in to replace an actor, I forget who couldn't do the film, couldn't appear in the scene. Alex Garland reached out to him because, of course, Kirsten Dunst is a partner of Jesse Plemons'. She said, "Oh, we need this guy for this scene." It's a brilliant scene, Jesse Plemons is. It's in the trailer. It was an absolutely defining moment. For me, it was the scene in the trailer that made me want to see the film. But in a weird way, it's the only scene in the film that also made me want to see the film. And unfortunately, I'd already seen it in the trailer, almost at length. And I think that in that one moment, what kind of an American are you? That is the richest moment in the film, and I felt that could have been explored much more by the rest of the film. Now, yes, I get it, it's not a film about sides and political ideologies, it's actually a film about journalism. But I think something else has happened to being able to even make a film about journalism. The cornerstones and definitions of what makes good journalism have been blown up in smoke since the October the 7th atrocity and the coverage of the Gaza genocide subsequent. Journalism is a bust flush. The ideas of objectivity and impartiality and all this stuff, it's meaningless and spurious when something in front of you is happening and you just simply don't report it because you're arguing for some kind of impartiality, so you ignore awfulness. So I didn't even find it an interesting film about the role of journalists or photojournalism. I think, if anything, it pointed towards the requirement to be something of a sociopath and a psychopath to take photographs in these zones and feel nothing for your subject. Kaylee Spenny was good, but I didn't believe her. There were so many elements to this film that didn't feel worked through, and I wonder whether it got made on the strength of Alex Garland's name alone. This should have been a multifaceted, multi-thematic, deep dive into all sorts of complexity, and I think he was a coward. I think he chose not to. Maybe he was put under pressure by the studios. I don't know, but this felt like a misfire, a missed opportunity by Alex Garland, and so for me, it just sagged and was a massive, crushing disappointment. Another massive disappointment, also from my favourite studio, producer, distributor, if you like, A24, was Maxine, which is the final film in the trilogy of Pearl X, Maxine, the films that star the wondrous Mia Goth as this kind of character across time, or different generations of a woman across time, wanting fame, seeking fame. X was okay. Pearl was excellent. I think Pearl even featured in our top 10 films last year. But Maxine, just weirdly, the focus of the three films was at its strongest when it was located within the Hicksville farmyard barn environment of rural America, where Maxine, where Pearl, where she came from. The moment it was thrown into 1980s, 70s, 80s Hollywood, LA, and you've got the stalker murders going on. What completely neutered this film was having a serial killer or serial killing going on around a character that you were still in the you're still in the job of kind of building her notoriety and her menace and her threat. And so consequently in this film, she kind of played second fiddle to the stalker. It became very confused. It wasn't grindhouse enough. It was diluted, it was unnecessarily complicated, and the claustrophobia and intensity, I think, of Mia Goth makes this trilogy of films. She became sort of fractured in amongst so many other characters in the hullabaloo of Hollywood, and in the end it wasn't scary. It wasn't scary. It wasn't unsettling. It didn't make you think. It didn't make you feel. Because sometimes unsettling and scary doesn't have to be about shocks or blood or dismemberment or surprises or supernatural. It can be as powerful as just that final shot in Pearl where Mia Goth was just staring into the camera. This lacked all of that, bar one moment where she does an audition. So for me, Maxine, a huge disappointment, a real sort of deflation right at the end of, you know, what was otherwise a really quite sort of uneven but interesting horror trilogy. And so we're getting to the two biggest disappointments of the year, and I'm going to start with my next to last biggest disappointment of the year. I loved Hunger by Steve McQueen. I absolutely loved it. I thought it was a sensational film. And I really loved 12 Years a Slave. I enjoyed parts of Shame. I found it a bit too much sometimes, looking at Michael Fassbender's penis and all that sort of stuff. But I love 12 Years a Slave, didn't like Widows, and I really didn't like Blitz. And I really wanted to like this film because it's about an important thing. It's about an important moment in history. It's about an important moment in history, the Blitz in London, from an importantly underrepresented, not important, but an underrepresented sector of society, you know, the black experience in World War II. That's something I'm totally wanting to get on board with. And that's not to say that in making the film, he has absolutely, Steve McQueen, thrown a spotlight over a not known about, not talked about, not even considered cultural aspect of World War II, i.e. the black experience, and then, you know, the black child experience. But I have to say, the problem I had with this film was, it was as if every single nuanced, artistic, filmmaking auteur quality Steve McQueen has built over his incredibly reputable career, both as an artist, a visual artist, an installation artist, but also as a filmmaker, Oscar winner, etc. It was like everything had gone out the window, and I couldn't work out whether what happened with this film was that his foray into that wonderful Small Axe, was it, series that he did for the BBC? This film felt very parochial, very small. For saying it was such a big subject matter, it felt very small, and it felt very local, and it felt very sort of cheesy, I hate to say. It felt cliche ridden. The characters, whether it be Stephen Graham as the almost Fagin-esque kind of child catcher running around the ruins of London, right down to the wonderfully played, but kind of structurally in terms of the story, the black military policeman who kind of befriends this boy who, you know, who's been sent off, you know, an evacuee to the countryside, but he jumps off the train, right down to how he jumped off the train. Every single moment in this film, every dramatic moment in this film felt cliched, hackneyed, and really saccharine and softened and cozy. I mean, how, you know, it all felt too cozy, right down to singing on the tubes. I found Saoirse Ronan's Cockney accent a bit too salty earth. I just found it all risible, and it felt incredibly dumbed down. And I hate to say it, it felt patronising. It felt really patronising and simplistic. And I wanted something that was a little bit more kind of nuanced and sophisticated and gut-wrenching and emotional. But even the emotional cues in this, you know, Saoirse Ronan essentially wanders around this film for most of it, not knowing where her son is, but doing nothing much. It was a real disappointment. I found this was like boring, predictable, and obvious. Everything in it was obvious. Which brings me to the final film of the year, my final worst film of the year. What could be the film that could in any way this year generate such hostility, frustration, infuriated kind of disbelief as Tar did, the Cate Blanchett film, which I found the most pretentious, self-indulgent twaddle I've ever seen trotted out in the history of cinema. Well, this film, I can't wrap my head round how this film has crept onto, and I'm sure many will say the same of the Joker film. And this is the joy of film. Although I can't get my head wrapped around it, I don't dismiss anyone who puts this film in their top 10. It's that wonderful thing about differences of opinion. But how this film could in any way have worked for anyone, I don't understand. I literally don't understand. And this is Challengers, Luca Guadagnino's, let's call it the tennis threesome romp, which, just say tennis threesome romp, those three words are infinitely more exciting than what they purport to describe, which is this film. If I'd been given an erotic, even uncomfortable, sexy film about a threesome, not literally the threesome, but the love triangle of two tennis players and one of their coaches, Zendaya, I'm up for that. I'm not a big fan of tennis. I'm not a big fan of it as a cinematic subject. I can't think of many times where I felt the tennis court, the tennis racket, and tennis players and the tennis ball can become cinematic, cool and sexy. But hey, what do I know? They try and do this right down to, we have a prolonged sequence where the camera is the ball, literally the POV of the ball being hit across a net, which was just, at that point, I felt this film had completely lost its marbles. This was not sexy. Lots of people said it was. It was totally unsexy. There was zero chemistry from Zendaya towards either of the two guys, played by Josh O'Connor and Mike Feist. Mike Feist of the two, I think, there was nothing about this to kind of to justify it to me. I mean, the story arc, her control, because she starts out as a tennis player, she gets a terrible injury, horrendous injury to be fair, straight out of Suspiria, that sort of knee jerking, breaking, limb breaking sort of scene. But she was a thwarted tennis player who then goes on to manage these two men. There were many dark reservoirs of kind of control and jealousy. Could she try and destroy the careers of two men because she couldn't have her own career? But I didn't buy into her sexual attraction to Josh O'Connor. I didn't buy into Josh O'Connor or Mike. I think of the three of them, I think if this did anything, it made me feel sorry for Mike Feist, actually. But the whole thing was twee, and it was surface, and it was unstylized. Some people have said this was stylistic cinema at its best. This was the most unstylistic cinema at its worst. It was boring. It was not inventively covered or inventively shot. The story arc, we bounced back and forth in time in an obvious kind of, he may as well, when he did a flashback, have had the sound of a tennis ball being twanged across the net and had a ball wipe across it like you do with an action replay. It was that obvious. It was dated. It felt old. This felt like a film that was made back in 1960 that was shit then and hasn't even got better with the passage of time. This was ghastly. And I really am beginning to lose my shit about the fact that more and more people keep saying it was such a sexy film. If this is your idea of sex or sexiness, you're not having sex. And there you have my worst films, biggest disappointments, car crashes and train smashes of the year. Do you agree? What are your worst films of 2024?